Hello, my name is Kevin Murphy, and I am the Kenneth L. Treffs Chair in Finance in the Department of Finance and Business Economics at the USC Marshall School of Business. I want to talk to you today about the provisions in the CARES Act intended to help mid-sized and large businesses during the pandemic. As a spoiler alert, I can't read these provisions without thinking of President Ronald Reagan, who would often remind us that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." On March 27th, President Donald Trump signed into law the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, also known as the CARES Act. The law provides over $2 trillion in emergency relief to various individuals and businesses impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The 335-page act was negotiated and signed in a matter of days and represents the largest ever economic stimulus plan in U.S. history. A component of the CARES Act that has attracted a lot of attention is the Paycheck Protection Program in Section 1102. This program, called PPP, provides forgivable loans through the Small Business Administration to help businesses with less than 500 employees pay their employees during the COVID-19 crisis. The loans are forgivable as long as at least 75% of the loan amount is used for payroll costs, and as long as the borrower maintains its employment levels at the level it had on February 15th, or rehires any employees that had been laid off after February 15th. The first round of PPP, which started on April 3rd, provided $350 billion in loans and ran out of money just 13 days later. The program came under fire after it was revealed that nearly 300 publicly traded companies, such as Shake Shack, Nathan's Famous, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, and AutoNation, had received loans under a program aimed at protecting struggling small businesses. These larger companies were able to qualify for the loans because individual locations, such as a single restaurant, employed fewer than 500 employees. Loans were also made available to entities such as the Los Angeles Lakers, arguably the most valuable franchise in the NBA. Congress allocated an additional $320 billion in PPP funding on April 23rd. Publicly traded companies with access to other capital were explicitly discouraged from applying for loans under Round 2 of the PPP. Moreover, dozens of the first round recipients were publicly shamed into returning the loans. The applications under Round 2, which started on April 27th, again overwhelmed the system. The demand is not surprising. There are thousands of struggling small businesses in our economy that are failing because the state and local governments have shut them down to flatten the curve. Besides, a forgivable loan is awfully close to free money, and who doesn't want free money? Well, remember that 75% of the loan has to be for payroll expenses, and you must maintain your headcount before anything is forgiven. This isn't very helpful to businesses with mounting mortgage interest, rent or lease payments, utility bills, or debt payments that are large relative to payroll costs. But mostly, I want to focus on what the CARES Act provides for companies with more than 500 employees. We'll see that the money provided to these larger employers is far from free, and in fact comes with enough strings attached that I predict that more mid-sized businesses will be destroyed than are helped. So let's talk about Section 4003 of the CARES Act, which we should from now on call the Corporations Alarmed by Restrictions on Employment and Salaries Act. Under Section 4003, the Secretary of the Treasury is authorized to make up to $500 billion in loans, loan guarantees, and other investments. $46 billion of the total was earmarked for air carriers, including $25 billion for passenger air carriers, $4 billion for cargo air carriers, and $17 billion for businesses critical to maintaining national security, which is a vaguely defined category, but think of it as supporting Boeing and suppliers to Boeing. The remaining $454 billion is available to other businesses with more than 500 employees. The loans, loan guarantees, or other investments under Section 4003 are not forgivable, In other words, the company is on the hook for repayment. But they come with strings. A lot of strings. More than on a tennis racket. We are all used to the concept of debt covenants, which are commitments corporate borrowers make when taking out bank loans. These covenants are usually put in place to ensure that the borrower can service the debt, that is, end up with enough cash flow to pay the principal and interest payments to the lender. The covenants naturally disappear once the borrower has fully repaid the loan. But under Section 4003, the covenants do not disappear once the loan is repaid, and most extend to 1 or 2 years after the loan is repaid. In addition, most are included to satisfy political objectives rather than protecting the lender, in this case, the U.S. taxpayers. Let's look deeper. First, corporations borrowing under Section 4003 must commit to not paying dividends, buying back stock, or making any capital contributions for a full year after the loan is paid back. For the air carriers, the commitment is for 2 years after the loans are made, even if they are paid back earlier. Now, to be sure, the corporations with short-term cash flow obligations requiring government loans under Section 4003 are not about to take that money and immediately pay it out to shareholders anyway. That is not a problem or a concern. The concern is what happens after the COVID-19 crisis has subsided. We are up and running, we have repaid the government for the loans plus interest, and we are generating cash flow in excess of what we need to fund any promising investments. Textbook finance and common sense tells us that we should be giving this cash back to our shareholders so that they can invest in firms and sectors that actually have more promising investment opportunities. If we borrow under Section 4003, we have to wait at least a year before making payouts to shareholders. The underlying political idea in Congress, of course, is that making unneeded internal investments is better than giving money to shareholders. But remember that those unneeded internal investments, which Congress loves, includes not only hiring or overpaying more employees than the company requires, but also facilitates buying corporate jets, building fancy headquarters buildings, this one's Apple's, paying excessive executive compensation, and launching unprofitable pet projects and other unproductive activities. On the other hand, the shareholders, which Congress hates, largely includes beneficiaries of public and private defined benefit and defined contribution pension plans. That is, all of us. Second, Section 4003 requires companies borrowing money to freeze the compensation for employees earning more than $425,000 but less than $3 million at no more than what they made during the 2019 calendar year. Now, $425,000 is a lot of money, unless, of course, you live in New York City trying to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. But most large organizations have hundreds of talented employees subject to this pay cap. This chart shows the distribution of 2018 total compensation for approximately 9,000 executives in the Composite S&P 1500 index. I'm using 2018 pay here because data for 2019 are just now becoming available. You can see that the distribution is very skewed, with more than 100 executives earning more than $20 million. What matters for our purposes, however, is that more than 96% had 2018 compensation above $425,000. And remember, these restrictions apply not only to executives, but to anyone making $425,000 or more. Freezing pay at these levels for a full year after the loans are repaid creates a disadvantage for firms taking loans under Section 4003, while creating potential hiring opportunities for firms not taking the government loans. For firms paid more than $3 million in 2019, Section 4003 requires actual pay cuts from the time the loan is taken and for a full year after the loans are repaid. In particular, for these employees, pay is capped at $3 million plus half of the difference between $3 million and what the employee was paid in 2019. For example, if the employee was paid $6 million in 2019, the maximum pay would be $4.5 million a year until a year after the loan was repaid. Now, we're not feeling sorry for any employee making this much. But for some context, nearly 40% of the executives in the Composite S&P 1500 index had pay above this amount. Once again, great hiring opportunities for firms not taking the government loans. And remember, these employees often have employment contracts and are likely to sue if their contractual terms are violated. Even worse, these contracts often give employees the right to resign for good reason if their pay is cut, potentially triggering millions of dollars in severance payments and the loss of top executive talent. To be fair, Section 4003 also put a cap on severance payments, also in violation of existing contract. But it's like the Dutch boy poking his finger in a hole to plug a leak in a dike. Leaks will spring up in different places, and pretty soon you're out of fingers. The compensation limitations of the CARES Act leave a lot of questions to be answered, with the Secretary of Treasury basically saying, trust us and take the money now, and we'll figure out the rules later. Some of the questions are pretty basic, such as, how is compensation defined? The CARES Act defines total compensation as salaries, bonuses, awards of stock, and other financial benefits. But it doesn't tell us if the awards of stock are measured on the grant date, as in SEC disclosures and accounting rules, or measured at the time the shares vest or the options are exercised, which is what matters for individual and corporate tax returns. The Act also doesn't specify what happens to employees who were hired or promoted during 2019, so only have pay for part of that period. And what the heck is included in financial benefits? Don't worry about the details. After all, the lenders are from the government, and they're here to help. By the way, if you don't want to borrow under Section 4003, you can always try to get a loan under the Federal Reserve's Main Street Lending Program. But don't get your hopes up on avoiding the restrictions under the CARES Act, because the Fed adopted identical restrictions on dividends, buybacks, and compensation. This is all pretty bad, but things get even worse under the CARES Act for mid-sized borrowers, which includes publicly and privately held corporations and not-profits with between 500 and 10,000 employees. For some context, this group characterizes almost half of all publicly traded firms in the U.S. and many, many more private firms and not-for-profits. For these mid-sized businesses, the funds borrowed under Section 4003 must be used to retain at least 90% of its workforce as of March 24, 2020, up until September 30th, 2020, at full pay and benefits. Now, remember that March 24th was well after the state government shut down most businesses, and so many businesses had already laid off a large number of employees. So, Section 4003 added another provision, which is that the borrower must commit to restoring 90% of the workforce it had on February 1st, 2020, long before many were taking the virus seriously in the U.S., at full pay and benefits by no later than 4 months after the cancellation of the national healthcare emergency. But wait, there's more. The borrower must also commit to not outsource any jobs or to offshore any jobs, that is, hiring any workers working in other countries, until 2 full years after the loan is completely repaid and the economy is presumably up and running. Hey, do you like labor unions? Well, then the CARES Act is for you. For loans taken out under Section 4003 of the CARES Act, the borrower must commit to not try to negotiate any existing union agreements during the term of the loan and for 2 full years after the loan is completely repaid. If you are not yet unionized, the CARES Act forbids mid-sized borrowers from opposing any union organizing effort until the loan is repaid. Hey, and remember that pay freeze for employees making more than $425,000 in calendar year 2019? The freeze doesn't apply to union members. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help organize labor. The CARES Act puts additional restrictions on air carriers, who, as you know, have canceled 95% of their flights given U.S. mandated prohibitions on international flights and national guidelines discouraging non-essential domestic air travel. Air carriers receiving assistance under the CARES Act must refrain from layoffs, furloughs, or reducing employees' compensation and benefits through September 30th, 2020. But let's be clear. These workers were already unemployed. There are no flights and nothing for them to do. We are quibbling over who pays them during the pandemic. In addition, in order to qualify for financing, Congress gets to dictate which routes the airlines will be required to fly, regardless of the demand. What do you want to guess about how many of these nearly empty flights will arrive near the homes or vacation homes of congressmen or women or senators? Just speculation, of course, but it'll be interesting to do the analysis. Perhaps more alarmingly, government aid to the air carriers in the form of loans will receive equity in the air carriers. The equity appears to be in the form of warrants, which are effectively stock options issued by the company and giving the government the right to purchase shares of stock at the pandemic-induced reduced price. If all goes to plan, the U.S. government may end up being the largest shareholder in most of our major airlines. Remember the old U.S. Airways? Pretty soon, all carriers might literally be U.S. Airways. What can possibly go wrong? Pretty much everything. What will be the effect of these government interventions with all those strings attached? Let me share my own feelings of déjà vu all over again and compare the current programs in the CARES Act to what happened under the Troubled Asset Relief Program known as TARP during the financial crisis. Some history is relevant. By fall 2008, it was clear that the financial system was near collapse. On Monday, September 15th of that year, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, and Bank of America agreed to purchase Merrill Lynch, which was also headed for bankruptcy. The next day, the Federal Reserve gave an emergency $85 billion loan to the big insurance company AIG, who was a major holder of collateralized debt obligations that effectively insured lenders against defaults by borrowers. By Friday, September 19th, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson called for the government to purchase the troubled assets from the banks. This was a challenging request because we knew banks had troubled assets, but there was no way of knowing exactly which assets were troubled. Secretary Paulson was insistent that there be no restrictions on banking bonuses or compensation, since he was worried the banks wouldn't take the money. After the Dow Jones average fell by 10% in a couple of days in early October, Secretary Paulson summoned CEOs from the 9 largest banks to meet in Washington, D.C., with Paulson and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the head of the New York Fed, the chair of the FDIC, and the comptroller of currency. At this meeting, the 9 CEOs were told that the U.S. Treasury would be investing $125 billion in capital in the nine banks in return for preferred shares and warrants under its new TARP program. The CEOs were also told that they had to agree to relatively modest restrictions on their compensation. A few of the CEOs resisted, but the regulators convinced them they really had no choice in the matter. The one-page application process was ridiculously streamlined, requiring the CEOs to only put in the amount and give their signature. Citigroup, for example, took $25 billion. Bank of New York Mellon took $3 billion. Bank of America took $15 billion. JP Morgan took $25 billion. Goldman Sachs first wrote down $25 billion and then said, I think $10 billion's enough. So they got $10 billion. Morgan Stanley got $10 billion. And Merrill Lynch, soon to be bought by Bank of America, received $10 billion. In November 2008, the Democrats swept to power in the national elections and were hell-bent on punishing banking executives for their alleged role in the financial crisis. In February 2009, just a month after President Obama took office, Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which imposed draconian and retroactive retroactive restrictions on pay for the top 25 executives in any bank taking money under TARP. The restrictions included prohibitions on bonuses, stock options, and any form of incentive compensation except for a modest amount of restricted stock that couldn't be worth more than half of base salary. The act also mandated clawback arrangements to recoup money already paid to executives, imposed strict limits on severance payments, and imposed a $500,000 per executive limit on the amount of pay the bank would be able to deduct as a compensation expense. As with the CARES Act, the 2009 Act left a lot to be promulgated by the Treasury Department. It took a while. On June 10th, 2009, the U.S. Treasury finally released its formal guidelines, and it appointed a pay czar to monitor and regulate pay at the individual banks. For full disclosure, I was testifying on banking bonuses at a hearing of Congress's Financial Services Committee when the guidelines were published, and was appointed by Treasury to be a formal but unpaid advisor to the pay czar. For the record, the fact that I was an advisor does not imply that any of my advice was taken, but that's another story. But here's the rest of this story, which presents a cautionary tale for lending under the CARES Act. On June 17th, 2009, just a week after Treasury formalized the compensation restrictions, 5 of the 9 initial recipients of TARP funding petitioned to repay the government in full, much to the chagrin of both Treasury and the Federal Reserve, who wanted to keep the capital on the bank's balance sheets. 3 more of the initial recipients repaid in early December, allowing the banks to avoid the pay restrictions in time to make their year-end bonus decisions. Ultimately, hundreds of banks, mostly small ones not hindered by restrictions on compensation, received TARP money. But with the exception of AIG and General Motors, who arguably should not have been eligible anyway, the bulk of the TARP funds were repaid as soon as the restrictions were announced, or at least as soon as they seriously precluded compensation outcomes. We can have a decent debate over whether the executives of large banks were appropriately punished for their role in causing the financial crisis, but no one is accusing banks or any other sector for causing the COVID-19 crisis. But the lessons are the same. The bottom line is that when bailouts come with a price, they are often refused, even if the money is needed. My conclusion is the CARES Act doesn't care about mid-sized businesses, and ultimately will hurt them and make many of them go out of business. Businesses borrowing under Section 4003 are forced to accept conditions detrimental to the long-run survival of any business. The myriad strings attached to the loans implies that some firms that could have been saved won't be saved. In addition, the government loan guarantees will predictably crowd out traditional bank lending with fewer strings attached. Section 4003 of the CARES Act is formally titled the Emergency Relief and Taxpayer Protections. The sponsors of Section 4003 claim that the loans protect taxpayers since, unlike loans under the PPP, the loans under Section 4003 are not forgivable. For once, I agree with the sponsors. The Section 4003 loan program is unforgivable. Let me conclude on a less pessimistic note, again drawing comparisons between the COVID-19 crisis and the 2008 financial crisis. Our economy rebounded after the financial crisis. Our banking system remained intact in spite of efforts such as Dodd-Frank to destroy it. With only a couple notable exceptions, the TARP investments made by the U.S. Treasury have been fully repaid with interest. The beauty of the American economic system is that, without any government intervention, capital has a way of ending up in the hands of the individuals or businesses that can use it most productively, whether they be large corporations or mom-and-pop restaurants, nail salons, or barbershops. I can predict with certainty that the U.S. economy will rebound after the current crisis. Our economy started off strong and is amazingly resilient. Businesses will reopen in our new normal, and our banks will be there to get capital to those who can use it most productively. Sadly, some businesses won't survive, but others left for dead will arise from the ashes. Many new businesses will be launched or expanded, taking advantage of the opportunities created in our post-COVID economy. We'll be okay, as long as no one from the government comes to help.